Hello and welcome back to Blame Theory. We are back after a longish hiatus. I've been working on a book. May talk about that a little bit later as it has some relevance to our topic today. So we're back to talk about the ideas that have shaped our world and who or what we can blame. And of course, the person everyone is blaming these days is the late Jeffrey Epstein. So Ashley and I are going to discuss the topic that no one can seem to get enough of, which is the career of the late disgraced financier and philanthropist. So, Ashley, you've written about Epstein. You wrote about Epstein's necrophilia, and I perhaps suggest we start by just explaining what inspired you to approach it from the angle of necrophilia and where you're getting that concept and the particular way that you're using it.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a weird one. And, I've often been hostile to the Frankfurt School. And yet I find myself continually coming back to people like Eric Fromm and Henrik Grossman, people who had quite kind of famous falling outs with the Frankfurt School. And yeah, I find Eric Fromm's work always very, very interesting. And I just happen to have been kind of perusing through my bookshelf, and I was actually writing a completely different piece. I wanted to write a completely different piece, and I picked up The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness with a completely different idea in mind. And as I started reading, I thought to myself, yeah, why didn't I think of this? Why didn't I think of this before? Because Fromm has this concept of necrophilia, and by that, of course, he doesn't mean the sexual perversion, but a kind of cultural perversion, a cultural ethos, a cultural outlook that he thinks is pervading our cybernetic societies, which is the passionate attraction to all that is dead, decaying, lifeless, and purely mechanical. And I thought this answers a question that I've had mulling around in my head for quite a long time. And obviously there's not one single answer to this, but why is it that it's going to be quite different than what I actually wrote, but the original question I had in my mind was, why is it that child protection so often coincides with child exploitation? And what I had in mind were, obviously I've been researching child protection for a long time, because of my work with the Center for Parenting Culture Studies. And obviously I don't think child protection is all bad, but I research overreach. And I have seen a lot. So, for instance, there was a scandal some years back about the Norwegian Child Protection Agency and its overreach and its tendency, in particular, to come down harder and take away more immigrant children. The Danish Child Protection Agency, very similar, and the way that they seem to desire regularity above all else, that they really just hate the unpredictability of family life. And there was a case some years ago with the Norwegian Child Protection Agency where there was this particular judge who was very critical of parents, very quick to take children away. He was accused of saying trumping up all these reasons to separate children from their parents. And then it turned out that he himself was in possession of enormous amounts of child sexual abuse material. And I thought that was really interesting, and I didn't necessarily think that it was coincidental. And so I that was kind of mulling around in my head. And then I noticed that, for instance, you had similar kinds of scandals with people within the trans movement who had been very quick to intervene between parents and children, to see parents as a barrier to the expression of the true self of the child. And then it comes out that some of the people within these movements were also in possession of child sexual abuse material. And then, Childline a few years ago put out this very strange video on kids' YouTube. So Childline it's been criticized for sort of having this outlook of, they start out with, okay, abuse, there's all this abuse that's happening behind closed doors and so on, and children need a direct line to be able to get help. And um and that's great, that's excellent, but what happened over time is it really got watered down, and it was like, talk about anything, and became like this almost like groomerous kind of ethos of like, bypass the adults in your life and trust the institutions, and don't worry, we won't tell kind of thing. And it was really weird. And sex education kind of went this direction as well, like, nothing leaves this room, don't worry, we won't tell, which has this weird kind of groomer logic to it. Anyways, and Childline put out these videos on YouTube, or this video on YouTube that was like about porn for kids. And it was like, if you want to see more people getting it on than just straight white people, and I'm not joking, go look this up. I've linked it in the article. Then you might want to look up BDSM and hardcore. You are over 18, aren't you? Wink, wink. Like, and it's so weird. So I wanted to kind of understand in a deeper way how these logics make sense. Like, how you can have this desire for this like overdrive, this desire in overdrive to kind of intervene in families, to come between parents and children, an extraordinarily suspicious eye on the adult generation that weirdly manifests in overreach and child protection, but also can it be expressed in child exploitation. And I might be, it sounds probably like I'm grasping at straws here, but I just noticed this so many times that I found it really interesting. And there's one obvious answer, which is that, and Jo Bartosz and her co-author, whose name escapes me at the moment, in their book Pornocracy, also talk about this, where they talk about how even like UNESCO's frameworks for children's rights talk about children as sexual beings, and how childhood sexuality, and this like goes back, on the left, to like through Foucault and so on, of like children as being sexual beings from the beginning, and that the family and society represses this, and basically nobody can grow up and have a healthy sexuality in society because of the institution of the family, because of sexual repression and all this stuff, which is also the logic that child predators use when they justify to themselves what they're doing. Anyways, so all of this is a very roundabout way to say that I was trying to understand why this is the case, and as I was so it's been in the back of my mind, and as I was reading Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, all of this stuff kind of clicked in place, and weirdly, it clicked in place when I started to think about how this applied to somebody like Jeffrey Epstein, because I don't think that he was particularly interesting for the enormous amount of claims that are thrown at him, like they were literally eating babies and this sort of thing. But instead, I find him interesting because of the way that he brings together all of these, what Fromm would call necrophilous orientations of our culture, and how they get expressed. And he very helpfully compresses them into one dark figure so that you can see it all really clearly. So necrophilous culture has a hatred for life, right? They don't like the unpredictable, bloody, squishy, wet, leaky kind of character of life. They prefer the mechanical, what can be controlled, what can be engineered, made better, made more efficient. He says that the modern necrophile no longer craves the stench of death, but instead the cleanliness of machines. And he has all of these wonderful dreams that he doesn't really say where the dreams come from. I went through some biographies, and it seemed to me that a lot of them come from his the clinical practice of his students and some surveys that he did. But he has these dreams that seem to lay bare this a sense of the love of death and the love of like the engineering ethos in society, and its preference for what can be controlled and what is mechanical over what is alive. So this culture, when it comes to sex, it doesn't like biophilous sex, the sex that generates life, that carries something on, that moves into the future, that extends tradition from the past into the future. It prefers sex that's in the moment. Sex becomes not joy, but fun. It becomes the experience. It likes all the different body parts, right? That's necrophilia. And pornography is a very good example of this because it severs all the different body parts in different images, and it's fundamentally static. It's frozen in time. It's not sex that has a residue in society and like the leaky residue of life and a body that's with you and all of the complications that come with life and sexual relations in real life. So that's the kind of sex that is preferred. And unsurprisingly, in a figure like Jeffrey Epstein, you get, seems to me some kind of porn addiction, but also sex that is very much non-biophilous. It's to the extent that he was interested in generative sex, it was like in these weird fantasies of a ranch where he's going to have 20 women pregnant at a time, like to seed the human race with his DNA, like a production line. So that's very mechanical. And then you have, but he just lays bare a logic that I see in like child protection. I see the moving out across society. It's all over society, like in Childline, telling kids porn is really fun. It's sexy to watch. That's what it says. Porn is fun and sexy to watch because masturbation is, I'm going to get this. I'm just saying all sorts of horrible things here. This podcast is going to be like flagged on everything. But, masturbation is seen as safe. It's it's non-generative, and generative sex is like implicitly filed away for only those who are capable of doing it properly in like controlled conditions. When you are sufficiently middle class, and we had a piece in Compact recently by Ella Whelan, where she talks about how people when they have generative sex, when they feel they are allowed to have children to the extent that they feel they do anymore, it's or they are anymore, it's when they feel they are experts, that you have to be an expert to raise a child now. So that's just one example of how this kind of orientation goes out into society. It's attitude towards sex, but it's in all sorts of different things. I talk in the article about art, about even our dreams, and I really try to get across the idea of where this is all coming from. But maybe we'll get to that because I've just gone on for quite some time. But that's kind of what I was trying to do. I was trying to understand like this deeper logic and these weird things that are happening in society and how they all seem to come together in a figure like Jeffrey Epstein, who's very much like in his philanthropy, giving money to these people who are, very interested in social engineering. And obviously he gave money to all sorts of things, and he collected, academic acquaintances like, playing cards or whatever, collector's items, I meant to say. And so it's hard to draw conclusions, but at least it's clear from his own interest. He was constantly coming back to this idea of like social engineering, of control, of engineering society, of making it more efficient, of making, when there's a social problem, it goes right to the brain. And this is just everywhere in society. And that is necrophilia, a disgust with biological life and a preference for what can be engineered, trying to put everything into these clean production line kinds of logics. So I saw in him something that I think is just a microcosm of a very powerful ethos that pervades all sorts of institutions and our sort of cultural outlook on life and death, that I found very interesting. And I tried to use him as a vehicle to lay that bare. But at the end, my point was that you shouldn't really be so afraid of a unique, weird, deviant like Epstein. You should be more afraid of people like Esther Ranson, who are ostensibly charitable, kind, compassionate figures who nonetheless also lay bare this ideology that is suspicious of life and prefers death in the sense of prefers what can be mechanized.
Yeah, so to go on a slight tangent related to my own book research and things I've been writing about, but it does connect, because if we want to sort of think about the broader range of interests that Epstein seemed to have that drew him to certain scientists, technologists, people in academia, science, the tech world, like a lot of it kind of revolved around transhumanism. And I think we can draw a pretty clear line from this account of necrophilia you're deriving from Fromm to the sort of transhumanist worldview that informs much of the tech industry at this point. And I mean, this is like maybe a different version of the same point. But something I've been thinking about recently is that, there are all these people in the tech world who have been canceled for, I don't know, I mean, you can go back to James Damore saying, maybe women are on average like less likely to be interested in engineering than men. And, these average differences would explain why it's hard for Google to create a, exactly 50-50 workforce and blah, blah. And of course, that was a huge scandal. And then you have all these people who occasionally get in trouble for saying things about IQ and race and sort of average differences in IQ between racial groups. And so, what's interesting to me is that, like, there are all these people who have gotten into trouble for saying these kinds of things. And yet, as far as I can tell, almost the entire tech industry is unified by the belief that it is both desirable and inevitable to essentially eliminate humanity altogether and replace it with some sort of technological superintelligence. Like that, this
Yeah.
is not. No one has ever been canceled for essentially advocating the complete genocide of actually existing humanity in favor of some sort of machinic super race of the future. Like that, all these people, the people in the AI industry who are considered sort of benevolent and on the side of the angels, like they still believe the same stuff. There was an interesting quote from Sam Altman recently that you may have noticed, where he said something about, well, people complain about how AI, that sort of these AI data centers, require so much energy and like water for cooling them down and so on. But well, you're not really thinking about like how much energy and water it requires to raise a human being. So like humans are also
Oh,
very wasteful. And so, I mean, this is like another version of, I think, this attitude that you're describing. But I don't know. I guess I don't know if you agree with me, but this seems like sort of a similar phenomenon where, as with Epstein, there's sort of the singling out of this deviant figure. But in fact, the broader kind of views and attitudes that he embodies are very widespread. And, this is part of why he was able to cultivate so many ties with intellectual, political, business elites. But also, similarly, you have people within the kind of tech world who will get singled out for, saying something about race and IQ. But meanwhile, the people who actually just openly advocate, replacing humanity entirely with machines, like that's not a cancelable view, even though it's obviously a much more, kind of profoundly genocidal one. So I don't know. I'm curious, like, what you think of that. Do you agree there's some kind of connection there?
absolutely. And I've been saying this for a long time, that what happened with racism, for instance. So if you go back to, I talk about this in my second book, where um, racism, according to people like Ken and Malik and so on, emerges out of this fissure between what is and what can be, or what is promised to be, or is what is said to be. So we have like man, or we have like equality, brotherhood, and so on. But when you look out into the world, you see inequality, you see war, and you see, this requires an explanation. So why doesn't man seem to live up to how he is described? Or why is the world as it exists not what we have been promised? And you have an optimistic, and I like to come back to like Condorcet when I talk about this, because you have this kind of optimistic reading that says, well, look, the reason why we haven't been able to move beyond a lot of these problems is because we are we're overcoming them in society. We're starting to realize now that the obstacles are not given to us by God, but instead are out there for us to understand and overcome. And the more that we understand, the more that we will be able to overcome. And we're going to get to a point, he says, where the human lifespan will know of no upper limit. We basically won't even die anymore. And like, we're going to get so advanced because we'll just keep understanding things. And, obviously Marx was was similar in that the reason why things go wrong is out there in our systems. Even acting rationally, even people acting rationally will produce these irrational outcomes because the rot is inside the system itself in its proper functioning. But you had another answer, which was much more pessimistic, which was, it's in you. The reason why we will never get past these problems is because the problem is in us. It's in human beings. And no matter what you do, it will always be this way. But they were pretty, that was a view that was often selective. So it was the Irishmen. Well, why do Irish people have these problems? Because they have an inbuilt predilection for jollity and drink, and they will never get over that. And as long as they never get over that, they're always going to have these problems. Or the Black person is this and that, or the Indigenous person. We are close to God. These people are closer to animals, or women are closer to animals, and that's why they are consigned to the domestic sphere and so on. And then we started to realize, actually, there is more variation within races than so-called races than there is between races and so on. Actually, once you educate women, and Mill foresaw this, but once you educate women, the gaps start to close in various places. And everything, if not everything, but many things that were said to be inborn are not. But the lesson learned, in spite of all of this, we still have problems, right? And it's like whack-a-mole, terrible analogy, but like, you solve one problem one place, it just throws itself up somewhere else, and you're like, oh my gosh, no matter what we do, we still have these problems. And it's like, well, it's everybody. It's just us. It's all of us. It's not just women. It's not just Black people. Sorry, I made a terrible mistake. You're not animals. We're all animals. It's not that you're a lazy piece of, we're all lazy pieces of, me too. I too. And I say this like in relation to like mindfulness discourses and so on in the book. I see this all the time. Like, they are misanthropic on an equal playing field. They are equal opportunity misanthropes. They're equal opportunity racists, essentially, where they're like, I too need help keeping my hands out of the cookie jar. Don't we all have problems controlling ourselves? I too am lazy. So they're always doing this kind of thing. Like, they will not exempt themselves from the horrible picture that they're putting forward of human beings as this way of saying, like, we're all crap. And so, unfortunately, the lesson that we took from the advances of the 20th century in a lot of ways, but also the failures of the 20th century was like, we made a mistake. It's not that it was just Black people or women that were closer to nature. We're all closer to nature. I said this on the Compact podcast, and it's obviously not a particularly religious, original thing to say, but, we killed God not to put man in his place, but to kill both man and God at the same time. And all that's left is just animals. And that's become a very so-called progressive thing to say, that we're all just animals. What makes us think that we're so good? What makes us think that we're so special? So, that is a very, very widespread idea. It is, it strikes people when you talk about like the value of human life. It is such an empty thing. People hear religion. They don't hear like the humanist ethos that people like Marx and Feuerbach thought would, rise up in the place once we destroyed religion. All that's left is emptiness and a void. And part of that is the fact that we failed to realize a humanist ethics. So yeah, I think all of this stuff, all of this kind of like misanthropy gets a pass because it's equal. It's like, it's equally misanthropic for everybody. All of the racist ideas that were once reserved just for Black people or Native people or whatever, now are generalized to the entire population, and we call that progressive. But I also give in the book, and I give in this piece here, the reason why I think this happens. And I think, well, I kind of already said, there's a gap between what is and what ought to be, and we've not been able to reach it. And the reason has been relocated inside the subject, inside of us. We are the reason. That we will never overcome the present because the void is in us. The void between what is and what ought to be is in the human subject, and ever it shall be.
So yeah, Epstein, I think is interesting in this regard because he had this kind of, I suppose, almost uh, Enlightenment era. He was kind of this bizarre perversion of, some sort of Enlightenment era spirit of intellectual inquiry. That's sort of what I
Oh,
what I
that is a
find
very.
quite
I did
disturbing.
think about that. He's just like bizarro salons, you know. He would have all these
Yeah,
like
exactly.
dinners and stuff where they would actually like talk about how, basically this kind of transhumanist stuff.
Yeah. And so there is something kind of fascinating about this in relation to the history of ideas. And yeah, I suppose him being this figure who was carrying forward some version of this modernist project of inquiry, but in this, sort of increasingly perverse direction. And I don't know, I just, this is something we've talked about before, but I find the way a lot of this is covered is to sort of say, well, he was into eugenics, and isn't that weird and creepy? But as we've talked about before, the problem with that is that a lot of the people who would say it's weird and creepy are actually fully comfortable with all kinds of eugenics. And
Well,
so,
yeah, the problem is us that you're just always going to get soft versions of eugenics because you have to fix people.
yeah. But I mean, I'm wondering what do you see as kind of the through lines of the different figures who Epstein sort of brought together and was interested in? Like what sort of what more broadly do they show about sort of intellectual and scientific culture of the past few decades?
Well, this is where I was trying to be a bit more careful because it's while there's a through line in his own thought, he had all kinds of acquaintances and he seemed to just like rubbing shoulders with famous intellectuals. So, Chomsky in one of those emails corrects Epstein's racism, like, and tries to kind of steer him away from that kind of stuff. So, in terms of like the company he kept, that's difficult to say. And there are lots of people like that. I even saw when I was doing research for this, I pulled up a photo of somebody I knew from when I was 18 years old in Waterloo studying, doing my undergrad before I knew a damn thing about anything. Who was interested in applying anthropological laws to like the universe and weird things like that. Struck up a conversation with me about it when I was waitressing. He was at the Perimeter Institute. Poor guy is now in Wikipedia. It's on his Wikipedia page as part of the Great Purge. Uh, so it's like all sorts of weird stuff going on there. But in terms of his own interests and what he was putting money into, again, difficult to say because he gave to both parties, though he gave to, seems to me, what was it, Democrats or Republicans more? Now I've forgotten. But it's hard to like kind of say for sure. But in terms of his own interest, it's very clear that he was, according to the Stanford Review, obsessed with social engineering. Obsessed with social engineering. And to a certain extent, so is everybody. And this is why I put that paragraph in about Pareto, and I'm always trying to put paragraphs in about Pareto, and editors are always taking them out because they never get it. And I think it's so important. I think Pareto is another emblematic figure of this because so I start the necrophilia piece with a dream. That's when I read this, when I read this in Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, I read it like 5 times. I was like, this is our culture. Somebody was dreaming our culture. So it's an engineering student and he's dreaming of these couples dancing at a party. But you have these dreams where everything is suddenly very lethargic. You can hardly move. It's like that kind of dream and everything is slowing down. But then suddenly this couple strides in to save the day. They've got this toolkit and they stab the boy in a couple in the back. And he just kind of like falls to the side and they put a crank in his back and wind him up like a wind-up doll, and they do the same thing to his partner. And then they spring to life and everybody's dancing and the room is full of motion and everybody is energetic and very excited and happy. and happy, he says. And this is an engineering student. And Frum says, this is a dream of a necrophile. And the dream that I give at the end is the dream of horror of a biophile, seeing what the engineers are creating, seeing what society is becoming. But this is the dream of somebody like Pareto. So Pareto was an engineer, and I have been obsessed with him as a character. And he comes from an engineering background. And he is known for not creating, but developing on a tradition of applying mathematics to the economy. And he comes up with these beautiful equations modeling the economy in equilibrium, and it's perfect. And he uses all these engineering metaphors, and everything is perfectly balancing and so on. And it works. It works. Don't you see this beautiful, internally robust, but perilously externally fragile system is at the heart of our economy? And then he looks out into the world and people keep screwing it up. People keep screwing it up. And so as Pareto moves through his life, he becomes more and more pessimistic about human nature. He becomes a quote unquote sociologist. And it's from Pareto that we actually get the language of elites. And I use this stuff myself because I'm a populist and I use the word elites, but it pains me to do it because I know that nobody connects to any other language because I know it comes from Pareto. It bugs me. But anyways, he becomes more and more obsessed with sociology. And by that, I mean, really, it's psychology. And this is a tradition that goes on to this day. We do not have any alternative to this understanding of the system. So it doesn't matter if the system actually works like this, in fact, Pareto kind of knew it didn't. But you have to kind of intervene in the fragile world around this beautiful system in order to make it work, to kind of bring it in line with this. And as it doesn't work, because I think it's wrong, they don't say, hey, maybe we've actually misconceptualized the economy on the basis of some science from the late 19th century. They go, human beings are worse than we thought. And they become more and more pessimistic about human nature. They become more desperate to engineer the world around this economy to make it work. And as our economic system becomes increasingly fragile, increasingly riven with contradictions, we know there's no, quote unquote, we know there's no alternative because we tried in the 20th century and it ended in horror. We just have to we have to intervene, we have to engineer, we have to make the inputs more refined, right? Because if the machine works and the only way that distortion can be introduced from the outside is from the outside, then you have to refine the inputs. And what are the inputs? They're people. And that's why I ended the piece with the second dream of the biophile, where a young man, it's beautiful, and I don't do it justice. I really recommend people go read this. But he talks about one of his, I think it was a patient of his or one of his students, who dreams that he's going down, I should actually read it, who dreams that he's going down into a cavern and he sees these humanized swine loading bodies into one of these old-timey kind of mine carts. And he says, this is an earlier phase of human development. This is the Industrial Revolution, where we become like humanized swine and we're loading humans into the mine shaft, right? So we're like basically using human bodies to build the industrial world. And he said, and the dreamer says, I don't know if I woke up or if this was a continuation of the dream, but I keep dreaming. And I dream that I descend down deeper into a subterranean city and it's pulsating with artificial life. And he says, I see a city extraordinarily modern, made completely of steel and glass, the future. But as he moves through the city, he realizes that there's not a single living creature in it, not a man nor an animal. And in the heart of this silver metropolis is an electric transformer with black cables spilling from it like arteries. This is my rendition of it, it's not his wording. He picks up one of the cables and realizes with horror that it's not conducting energy, but human blood. And then it goes on. I don't put this part in, but he takes out a pocket knife and like cuts it open, and he's like covered in blood, and he wakes up in horror, covered in blood. And this is the man who realizes what the world that we have created, that you refine the input so much, it's just human blood going into the electric city, nothing else, no humans. And that is the world that you are seeing. The tech bros dreaming of and creating, that so much do they want to refine the inputs that there's no place for humans anymore. And in that, we have forgotten any sense, any human ethics at all that would say, hey, what was the point of all this if not for human beings? Because who cares? We were long ago humanized swine anyway. We're just inputs, and poor ones at that. We just need to be refined. And of course, we dream this all the time in our culture. Like, obviously, The Matrix is another example of this, but we sense it. It pervades everything. It pervades our art, and as I say, it seeps even into our dreams.
Something I discovered in my book research that sort of intrigued me is that when they made The Matrix, the filmmakers assigned the cast several books. One of them, famously, was Baudrillard's Simulation and Simulacra. But another, perhaps more surprising, was this book Out of Control by Kevin Kelly, which was a sort of manifesto of the 1990s sort of cyber utopian worldview, particularly articulated in the pages of Wired magazine, where Kelly was the executive editor. And Out of Control it's quite a fascinating book. But what's interesting about it is that, Kelly, I think, attempts to articulate a version of techno-utopianism that is, perhaps less necrophilous than some of the ones that we see today. In fact, what he describes or attempts to predict is what he calls the rise of neo-biological civilization. So it is a version of transhumanism, but he does, he does see the kind of continued, blood and guts presence of sort of, mucky biology as very much part of the picture. And, it's hard to characterize his argument simply, but it really is this kind of wild extrapolate. In fact, if people are familiar with the documentary Fast, Cheap, and Out of Control, I think it was the first documentary made by Errol Morris, which I recommend. You sort of get a visceral sense of what Kelly was interested in. Something a lot of people were interested in back then was that seems to not be so much of a hot topic anymore for whatever reason, is nanotechnology. And I think there you really see the fusion of a kind of a biological vision with a sort of calculating computational vision. So anyway, what's interesting, just to get back to the point, is that, again, I think if you compare Kelly to some of the other cyber utopian ideologues of the 90s, famously, John Perry Barlow's Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace describes cyberspace as the home of mind. So in other words, he kind of eliminates the human body from it. The early articulations of the singularity by, for example, Werner Vinge in the same period, similarly kind of imagine the future as a disembodied intelligence, kind of abstracted from the messy realities of biology. The famous another famous document of this period was George Gilder's Telecosm, which proclaimed the overthrow of matter. So there is this kind of strong tendency towards disembodiment and a kind of, philosophical idealism, the kind of purification of mind from the animal messiness of the body. But Kelly is quite different because he does actually see a place for the continued existence of the human body in all of this. But what's interesting is that the Matrix filmmakers picked up this book Out of Control, which again is quite even though it as the title suggests, it's partly arguing that the future will be one in which humans are no longer really able to exert control over their creations, that these kind of, weird neo-biological cybernetic hybrids will take on a life of their own and, take existence in directions that we can't really suspect. But for him, that is, he frames it in this very odd way. which is to say that, because we've been able to create these kind of autonomous entities that work on their own, humans have become like gods. But like God in the Bible, we need to endow these entities with free will and give them the freedom to do whatever they, whatever they opt to do. And so he sort of has uh, a weird fusion of this kind of laissez-faire libertarian attitude, which is typical among his milieu, but at the same time he kind of infuses it with this theological, this kind of Protestant theology of free will, that ultimately God needs to let his creations choose their own path. So anyway, what's interesting is that the Matrix filmmakers pick up this book and get their casts to read it, and I think part of what they do, but obviously they put a very dystopian twist on this idea of the kind of merger of the muckiness of biology with kind of advanced cybernetic systems. And it's really quite interesting. If you read the opening of this book, Out of Control, it imagines, or it actually describes Kelly's experience in this sort of experimental pod, which was being developed to, potentially use to send humans into space. And if you hear his description of being in this pod, it clearly was part of the inspiration for the scene in The Matrix in which Neo is awakened inside this kind of bizarre womb-like pod that he's been confined to by his robot overlords. And so anyway, it's kind of another interesting case of how these utopias end up kind of flipping into their opposite. But yeah, I do, I think Kelly is interesting because, as I said, I think he's relatively unusual among the sort of early cyber utopians in trying to, instead of just imagining a transcendence of the kind of messy wetware of biology, like trying to reserve or maintain or retain a kind of biophilic aspect of in this project, and yet I think that the most popular kind of cultural product that was partly inspired by Kelly's vision immediately takes this in a very, very dark direction.
That's so interesting, because that's something that Frum talks about, where he talks about the Necrophilis character flips over into destruction. If he can't have the world, the perfectly controlled world, then he won't have a world at all. And he talks about this through Hitler's orders to destroy all of Germany, which I didn't know about, actually. But he says that as the Allies were closing in, he gave the order to go scorched earth and just destroy absolutely everything, like all Germans, everything. And Frum says that this is perfectly indicative of his Necrophilis character, that he didn't, he says people don't do justice to the hatred that was in this man, that when they say that he hated Jews, of course he hated Jews, but he hated everything. Everybody hated life itself. And that was obvious when he said, well, look, if I can't have the great Nazi Germany, then I'll give the order to destroy it all. And he did, but of course it wasn't followed through on. And I thought about this with, when you think about some of these, obviously, like, I'm not making an argument ad Hitlerum, but to a much lesser extent, you can kind of see this weird flip over into destructiveness when the tech oligarchs talk about, oh yeah, we might destroy the world, but we'll make some money in the meantime. Like they're like kind of okay with the idea that, well, we might bring about the apocalypse, or you can see it in these,
we'll build
weird,
some great companies. I think that was Altman's.
Or like these kind of weird characters that you see online defending Made in Canada, and you can just see like they're raring to just destroy all of humanity. They're just like, well, we're just here to kind of be a cleanup crew for the horror of humanity's existence. Like, look at how destructive and disgusting we are. Like, what's the point? To live is to be a destroyer. So should we not just all delete ourselves? Let's start here, kind of thing. Like, so there's this the flip side of, well, it's not even the flip side, but this kind of like Necrophilis character that desires to create a world of perfect control and perfect mechanization. When it can't have that, it seeks to destroy it. And there was one thing that I wanted to say earlier, where I think that there's often some misunderstanding of my position. And I think, I think it's the way that I write. Sometimes I'm not clear enough. But people think that I'm like against automation. I'm against technology. I'm against bureaucracy even. I'm not against these things. I'm not even against transhumanism. My point is that all of these things can be used to free us, but we haven't been able to figure out how. And because we've not been able to move beyond that impasse, because of what happened in the 20th century, because the attempts to move beyond it, to realize any kind of dream of a human-centered utopia ended horribly and ended in their opposite, these things turn around and destroy us. They begin to eat us alive. The cliche is the means of production become the means of destruction. And that's what I'm against. And that's what I'm warning about. And I am not optimistic enough in my own writing, but I feel like when I talk, I'm optimistic because I do think that there is a way. Like, I am excited about, that you can see in algorithms the potential to automate an enormous amount of distribution and production. Drones flying all over the place, dropping packages could be fantastic. The trouble is that there's nobody in the city. There's the city. It's our blood that fuels it for nothing, and we're getting pushed more and more out of the process instead of becoming more and more central to it. And we just don't know how to get over that. We don't know how to reverse course. And so, because we have not been able to reach the utopia, we get this necrophilis destructiveness where it's like, maybe the world would be better off without us.
One thing that struck me as I was reading a few things about Epstein's, engagements with various significant sort of scientists and public intellectuals was he had. I mean, you mentioned where he sort of Chomsky tried to, Chomsky sort of woke scolded him on his that he needed to reconsider his racist views. But there was a similar incident where Steven Pinker, who is sort of an interesting figure in all of this. I think I was inclined to be very negative about him some years ago, but he is another interesting figure in terms of like he sort of explicitly made it his mission to revive and rescue the Enlightenment project sort of in the 2010s. And I guess I'm maybe less inclined to dismiss that than I maybe once was, but it was interesting that Epstein in one of these again sort of salons that brought him together with various of these figures. Apparently Epstein started talking about, basically in sort of population bomb terms, about how, charity in the third world is bad because it makes them have too many babies, and then we end up with this sort of Malthusian nightmare. And anyway, apparently Steven Pinker corrected him on this and sort of said, well, that's not really true, because if you have high rates of infant mortality, then actually women end up having more babies. And he sort of and it was interesting because evidently Epstein, and this was sometime in the 2000 sort of maybe around like 2007 2008, was essentially kind of repeating this sort of 70s era population bomb discourse about the uselessness of foreign aid because it would just kind of produce this Malthusian trap. And then Pinker sort of corrected him, and I suppose it's interesting in relation to the way that, and this is something we were sort of just talking about, that this whole kind of population bomb view was extremely fashionable and influential in the kinds of, sort of scientific and intellectual circles that we're talking about. Basically scientists who interface with sort of policy people and are, involved to some extent or another in all of these kind of schemes of social engineering that have been undertaken over the past, however many decades. And, for a while, the population bomb view was sort of the fashionable um, and heavily promoted one. And then I think I wouldn't know how to date this exactly, but it seems that sometime in the 90s to 2000s, it sort of fell out of favor. And so Pinker was sort of expressing was sort of telling Epstein, like, his views on this stuff were a bit out of date. Um, but I guess something else that we've talked about is the way that, the population bomb view is explicitly Malthusian. It's explicitly, and Malthus was clearly a kind of, it's actually, if you read Nick Land's Dark Enlightenment, coming out of this neo-reactionary sphere in the early 2010s, he highlights Malthus as kind of one of the figures of dark enlightenment, basically one of the figures of the Enlightenment era, but whose insights were fundamentally deeply reactionary. And for Land, this is a good thing. Like, this is high praise. So the point is, you did have this kind of neo-Malthusian view that was considered sort of de rigueur in progressive circles for a long time. And Epstein was still echoing it in the early to mid 2000s. And then Pinker corrected him. But I suppose something else we've sort of been talking about a bit is the way that even as this population bomb idea flips over into the opposite, where you have people like Elon Musk, sounding the warning about, population decline and the problem of decreasing fertility. An argument I've seen you make, Ashley, which I don't think you've written out in full yet, but is sort of that ultimately these are two versions of the same worldview. That the Elon Musk version is, which is concerned with population decline, is really not that different from the Ehrlich kind of 1970s population bomb vision of things.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And it's both sides of this are deeply misanthropic, because they both imagine that humanity is just a bunch of dumb automatons who reproduce the present indefinitely, and only one variable ever changes, and that is demography. So we were all being told, like, there's a population bomb going off, and now population implosion going off. And both of these assume that there's no agency, nothing that humans can do, nothing that human beings are implicitly doing. But yeah, there's this. I talk about Malthus in Significant Emotions, where I try to bring out these representative anecdotes, what Gusfield called representative anecdotes. These people who, I like this. I like Gusfield a lot, and I like the way that he does this. This idea where you can find in a person a kind of representative anecdote of an entire worldview. And that's what Epstein is for me. That's what Ranson is for me. That's what Frum sees in Hitler, and in some of these necrophiles that he describes. So I counterpose Blaise Pascal with Voltaire, because Pascal, I thought, perfectly exemplified. He has this thing where he's like, we have this, everything that we do, all the activities that men are engaged in do not constitute an expression of the self, but instead they are displacement, not fulfillment, but endless emptiness. That everything that we do is just a lie that allows us to deceive ourselves about the fact that we just can't sit quietly. And he says, I have discovered, and this is Marshall Berman kind of summarizing Pascal. He says that all the unhappiness of men arises from a single fact, that they are unable to stay quietly in one room. And I thought that was a perfect kind of encapsulation, a representative anecdote of this this recognition that society and history keeps moving, And it's like, and the blame is put on humanity's restlessness and their inability to just stay put. Like, why can't you just be happy? Like, why can't you just accept the way things are? And Voltaire says, well, we're lucky that we're not like that. We're lucky that we are restless. We're lucky that we find boredom in doing nothing, that we are active creatures, that we find our fulfillment in action in the world. But the problem with Voltaire, and Berman says this, is that he didn't seem to care that most of the activity that human beings were engaged in were meaningless within the current system. And that he was just sort of like, oh, everything's fine. And so this was always going to lead to this kind of this tension between these figures that are like seeing the wheel of history moving and wanting things to stay put, not having control over the movement of history, and those who cheered it on but didn't seem to care where it was going. And I think that Pascal and Voltaire are good examples of that. And Malthus is a good example of this as well, where he's like, why do you people have this sense like things are going to get better? And in fact, Malthus, and that's the other two representative anecdotes that I use in the book, is Malthus and Condorcet, because Malthus was writing his famous essay on the principle of population against Condorcet specifically, and Godwin. And he's like very dismissive. He's like, oh, you're talking about all these great things. And he said, we're never going to move beyond the present. Just stop trying. Why can't you just accept the way things are? Because this is what happens, we can't get to the utopia, not because of something outside of us, like you think, Godwin and Condorcet. No, it is in us. It's an eternal struggle between sex and death. And as soon as you have enough food, you're going to have too much sex, you have too many babies, they're all going to die. And so the cycle goes on and on and on. Can you not just accept that this is the way things are? Can you not just be content to sit quietly in your room? Can't you? And I see this like continually pervading out into like our institutionalization of things like mindfulness discourse, where they literally say like, and in fact, one of the very first texts on mindfulness from the 1950s literally has almost the exact same line as Pascal used. And he basically says, I have come to realize that most of the unhappiness of man is that we can't sit quietly in our room. And I have developed a method to sit quietly in your room and find all the fulfillment. But no, we will never be happy with that. We will always be discontented. We will always want to move forward. But as I said, we can't. We're stuck. We're stuck in the abyss between what is and what ought to be, the future that we know is possible. We know that. We like dimly perceive that things could be better because we're always told that we're like throwing too much stuff out. So we're producing too much stuff, and yet most of us don't feel like we have too much to consume. Most humans in the world don't feel that way. So we kind of know something's up, but we just don't know how to get there. And so we have this constant like struggle between these Malthusians who are like, no, we're never going to get there. Just accept this. If we've just got to find some way to get people to accept this, be it psychology or behavior management or whatever it is, to stop them being restless. Oh, it's just our annoying human nature that unfortunately you can't be content to sit in your cell. And those who are like, but I want to move beyond. And I feel like those who are like, but I want to move beyond, are like kind of like Voltaire, where maybe it's like the libertarians of today who are like, they grasp, at least they sense that there is a future, that there is something that humans can create that is better, but they kind of don't see humans as part of it, unfortunately. And so the only way that they can picture us moving past this impasse is not us, really, not most of us being there. Maybe technology alone goes on without us. I don't know. But I think there's this ongoing kind of tension in our culture between people who try to naturalize the impasse and people who try to technologize it. And there isn't a kind of mixture of these two things, of like the biology and the human and the technology moving forward together somehow in a way that is a human future.
Yeah, well, this is why I think Kevin Kelly, who I mentioned before, is sort of the more interesting of the cyber utopians of the 90s, because he does at least attempt that, although I think that the way he takes it is ultimately does resolve into this weird kind of anti-humanism, because what he ultimately doesn't want is for humans to pursue a political project that would be at odds with this vision of proliferating kind of human biological and sort of natural and technological hybrids that will just kind of spread their wings and float out into the cosmos and seed the universe with more life. It's a very weird sort of vision, and so it ultimately ends up having to be anti-political because he's afraid, as are the tech people today, that politics can only mean the masses interfering with their scheme, with their beautiful schemes and projects. So it's an interesting and ultimately failed attempt to go in that direction. And I think that that's part of why it becomes the inspiration for The Matrix, because I think the film does actually see where it leads quite successfully. But the other thing that has sort of been in the back of my mind is Fromm is a Freudian, so clearly there's an element of this, and I have not read The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness. It's on my list now, but that sort of has to do with Freud's basic distinction between eros and thanatos, or the life drive and the death drive, or the libido and the death drive. So I assume that that's sort of part of this framework. Yes.
Yeah, but he's very critical of Freud, and that's part of the reason why there was a bit of a falling out. So he tries to kind of move beyond Freud. Fromm's annoyance with Freud is that he doesn't fully reject psychoanalysis. Obviously, he remains psychoanalytic, and all the dreams and that sort of stuff speak to that. But he thinks that Freud ultimately located the roots of destructiveness and human motivation. He sort of mislocated the roots of that. And he's kind of continuing. And in fact, he talks about necrophilia in other books, in The Sane Society and Escape from Freedom. So he's really critical of the idea. Now, I'm not at all a person that goes into psychoanalysis, so I was kind of moving a little out of my comfort zone and using this. And in fact, I initially wrote about 5,000 words, and I thought about including it as a book chapter in the book that I've started to write, but I just don't want to venture into that territory because I don't know it well enough. But from my understanding is that his central disagreement is with Freud's understanding of the death drive, that the humans possess this sort of innate drive toward destruction, which has this equal force to eros, or life instinct. And he says there's no biological evidence of this innate drive toward destruction. It's not universal in the same way that sexuality is. And he looks at human cruelty as being completely different across cultures and historical time period. And he just really rejects this idea of a fixed biological drive. So he tries to, and I think, in my opinion, in a very unconvincing way. And that's why when I said, oh, you should read this book, I was thinking but ignore large parts of it because he tries to kind of build up from character. And I initially had a paragraph where I actually think Lash's use of characters much better than trying to kind of, he has this whole thing about it starts with the mother, and you have this weird relationship with the mother that gets messed up, and then that becomes the necrophile's drive, and you can build this kind of up to society and this sort of thing, which I just don't find at all convincing. And I think Lash's understanding of how a culture becomes narcissistic is much more convincing, in that every culture produces in the individual a version of itself in the form of personality. So it's the other way around. And I think that I would be much more structural about it, in the sense that what I've just explained, that this destruction of the human arises out of an increasingly anti-human economic system that progresses by pushing humans out of it, that creates wonders for humanity, but does so by destroying humanity at the same time. So I think that is what produces this necrophilous culture that then gets reproduced in our beliefs about society, about the human, and so on. But yeah, so he is a Freudian. He still holds on to Freud, but he builds his understanding of necrophilia out of a critique of Freud's understanding of Thanatos. He thinks that Freud is biologizing something that is essentially social.
The dreams, the first dream in particular was reminiscent for me of the story that forms the basis of Freud's analysis of the uncanny, which then has become the basis of this notion of the uncanny valley in robotics, which is the story the Sandman by E.T.A. Hoffmann, which was then it became an opera or part of an opera, The Tales of Hoffmann, and also the basis of a ballet called Coppelia. So, are you familiar with this, with the Sandman?
No, but you mentioned it, so tell me more.
Yeah, so the Sandman is a story about it's essentially a kind of prototype of the film Her, because it's about a young man who falls in love with an automaton. And there's so much interesting stuff to say about the story, but this is actually only part of the plot. But basically, he's a young man. He's studying, he's studying science. He's a young, sort of aspiring scientist at a German university, and he, looking out his window, spies the sight of a beautiful young woman in a house across the street. He becomes fixated on her, kind of what seems like her ideal perfection. And the reason the dream sequence that you discussed is so reminiscent of this is that then there's sort of a ball that's held by the girl's father, who's a scientist and inventor. And at the ball, he dances with this girl who's named Olympia. And in any case, the plot develops, but he dances with her, and everybody and she also sings. Everybody admires her beauty, but everybody thinks there's something a little bit off about her. She's just a bit too perfect. And so the young man is sort of enraptured by her, but everybody else is actually a little bit weirded out by her robotic perfection. And so for whatever reason, he doesn't perceive this, or is in fact attracted to her, whereas everybody else experiences what later becomes called this sort of uncanny valley effect, where she's just a little too perfect. So then the young man, sort of courts her, and there are these, it's weird because it's, on one hand, it's sort of a horror story, but at the same time, it has a lot of satire. And basically he's going and sort of rhapsodizing to her and reciting poetry to her and so on. And she, even though she can dance and sing perfectly, she can't really talk. So she just responds by saying, ah, ah, ah. And he doesn't find any problem with this. And then, basically he asked for her hand in marriage. Her father gives his approval, but then he goes over to visit her one night and finds her father struggling with this guy who is his sort of collaborator in various of his scientific experiments and technological projects. And eventually they get into this fight in which ultimately Olympia is torn apart limb from limb, and he sees on the inside she's made up of kind of box springs and sort of clockwork mechanisms and so on. And so at this point he goes mad. The young man loses his mind. and is sort of carted off to the asylum. Anyway, it's a really great story, but it does seem like it's relevant to all of this because it's set in this I think it's supposed to be Göttingen or one of these German universities that was at the time at the cutting edge of sort of science and technology. And it's kind of about and the father and the his collaborator who turns against him, and then sort of fights with him over ownership of Olympia, and then they end up tearing her apart, or seemingly involved in some sort of occult ritual practices. And I mean, there's much more to the story. That's only like one section of it. And Freud's analysis of it on the uncanny is incredibly fascinating. But part of what Freud was interested in is the sort of Oedipal dimension of the whole thing. Apviously, one thing that's important about Olympia is that she has a father, but she doesn't have a mother. So, in other words, she's a kind of a product of a kind of parthenogenesis, that she's the brainchild of her father, the scientist and inventor. And so but she only has a father, right? And Nathaniel, meanwhile, his father, who was also a sort of inventor and scientist, died in mysterious circumstances during his childhood. And that's another whole part of the story that I won't get into. But basically, Nathaniel, the young man, is brought up mostly by his mother. Olympia is the product of only a father. She has no mother, so she doesn't sort of pass through the Oedipal matrix, as the Freudian analyst might put it. And this is sort of reminiscent of all kinds of things, including we mentioned sort of Epstein's bizarre scheme to seed his DNA in these women who had just kind of again produced this kind of mechanized baby factory. So again, it's a kind of vision of reproduction in a purely kind of scientific technological vein, where the sort of Oedipal matrix of the family is removed from the equation. And I mean, there were also kind of schemes of that sort going on during the Enlightenment. You had those kind of horrible experiments where they tried to raise they took these babies and tried to like raise them without language just to see what would happen. and it didn't go well. So I don't know. The story is just really interesting in relation to a lot of this stuff, and I think it really presciently foresees the kind of necrophilous tendencies that these sort of technological and scientific projects can go in a certain direction. And anyway, it's just I think particularly the ball scene that I described is very reminiscent of that dream that Fromm is talking about. And I have to wonder if, as a somewhat renegade student of Freud, he was obviously had to be thinking about, and also as a cultivated German intellectual, he no doubt was aware of Hoffman's story. So that definitely came to mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously the roots of this stuff, the awareness of where this can all go, is there at the very beginning. The possibility of it all going horribly wrong is there at the very beginning. And people trace the famously, people trace the Holocaust to the very logic of the Enlightenment. But as I keep saying, it's when the means of production turn into the means of destruction, where humanity just kind of gets in the way of a smooth functioning of the economic system, then you just start eating them alive. But it's interesting too, I don't have a big point about this, but as you were describing that, I was thinking about all these weird stories coming up of people falling in love with AI. And like I'm sure you've seen that horrible clip of the guy like, I married my AI girlfriend, and the slightly dumbfounded wife is sitting there next to him. Like, well, and it's like, somebody once said, I think it was just like one of these posts online, where it was like, what a man wants is just a happy assistant. That's what he wants out of a relationship. And I was like, well, there you go. If you got your happy assistant, that's your AI girlfriend. I don't know. I have more faith in humans than that. You can always find a kind of some weird individuals. But the other thing too is, I think when there's nothing beyond the self, including the future, to orient ethics, like a human future an ethics oriented toward a human future, when most people agree that humanity doesn't really have a brighter future. I feel like, I don't know, maybe I'm overstating that, but I think if you ask most people on the street, are we heading toward a glorious human utopia? I don't think most people think that is the case. Then you get all these kinds of weird pathologies that result. And some of these are turning the body into the place where everything is realized, where you can kind of supplant. If you can't realize the ideal in the world, you can kind of realize it in your own self, in your own body. And I feel like part of that is transition, or the dream of transition, of transing yourself, of like transitioning genders. Like, now I can realize this sort of idealized image of the opposite sex, because I don't really know what that would be for my own sex, but I have a vision of you, the other, that I can kind of transition into. And the body becomes the end. And I found it really interesting. And I haven't thought this through at all, so I'm just thinking out loud. But isn't it interesting that the Matrix people, the Matrix was like, obviously, it seemed to me, an allegory for capitalism and us being kind of like stuck. And then years later, they were like, no, the whole thing was actually about trans.
Right.
The creators trans themselves. It's like, even that realization became written on the body. I don't know what to make of that, but I find that interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know. I've sort of had this half-baked theory that this goes in a slightly different direction, but that the reason that we can't that the reason that these visions of AGI, as essentially, which is very vaguely defined and so on, but as essentially a kind of equivalent an equivalent to human intelligence. That the reason that this doesn't work is because and this is where I revert to a kind of orthodox Freudianism, is that human intelligence is forged in the matrix of the Oedipal structure. And so an entity that does not pass through the Oedipal structure cannot achieve an intelligence that is in some way equivalent to human intelligence. I don't know. This is like, again, a very half-baked idea I've sort of brought up at a bar once or twice, but I haven't really articulated it. But I think perhaps the defensible core of it is something about how all of these visions of just extracting intelligence from the which really is, if you go back to the origins of the idea of the singularity, it really is about extracting intelligence from the messy biological wetware of human existence, and being able to realize a pure intelligence, in which, again, to quote some of these things, which takes place in this realm that's purely consists of mind, that is this kind of transcendent, kind of quasi divine entity. And I guess I'm just I want to argue that human intelligence, such as it is, only exists in relation to the the Oedipal matrix, the fact of coming out of another, of a woman's body, undergoing that separation from this body to which you are, in some sense, adjoined and inseparable. Undergoing the kind of traumatic process of coming to terms with your own separateness within this kind of social structure, like that. All of these things are not avoidable, and if you take them away, then what you end up with is some sort of monster. And this is also the insight of Frankenstein, that the problem with Frankenstein is with the creature, with Frankenstein's invention, is again partly that he's a kind of product of parthenogenesis, and because of that, he has no place in the world. His intelligence exists in no clear relation to anything socially, is sort of another way to put it. And therefore it just becomes this kind of free floating entity that cannot be directed at anything positive or productive, and therefore becomes a force of destruction, a force of kind of pure, essentially becomes a kind of killing machine. So yeah, I anyway, I'll have to try to elaborate this theory a bit more, but this is,
No,
I think there's a Freudian critique to be made of the entire project of artificial intelligence.
Yeah, I mean, I personally wouldn't use Freud. I would use like symbolic interactionism, like the mind can only exist in relation to other minds with shared meanings. But as you were talking, I was thinking, no one can ever help themselves from quoting Gramsci: "The old world is dying, the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters." And it is, now is the time of monsters. But that's exactly right. And just to go back to the kind of animating point of this conversation, which is this desire to kind of create this purely mechanized understanding of things, to take out all the life so that we can find the truth. And by doing that, you destroy it. And that's what necrophilia is, that it tries so hard to squeeze out of life an essence that it destroys it. And it tries to mechanize it, to control it. And in so doing, makes it not life. So, one of the stories that Fromm talks about in this, when he's talking about the necrophilic character, it's really gross, actually. There's all these like really awful stories, but there was one where a young man is in love with a girl, and he's only able to sleep with her once, and she's sick. I can't remember what she has, tuberculosis or something like that, and he's not able to sleep with her throughout her illness, and then she dies. And at her funeral, he cannot tear himself from the coffin. And he says, everybody who was there thought that I was overcome with grief and wanted to climb into the coffin because of this. But really, I was sexually excited, and I desired so much to crawl into the coffin and consummate. And I wanted to have sex with her body. And I just thought, yeah, because the whole time that she was sick, he couldn't touch her. Now she's dead. He can move her around exactly as he wants. He can do everything that he wants to her that he couldn't before. And I was like, yeah, man. But no, but I was thinking, like, that is the necrophilus orientation. It desires, only in death can you move things around as you want. And you can see this in our sciences, where, and I used to say this to students all the time, like, why sociology doesn't usually use experiments. Like, we try our best not to use experiments, because those disciplines that try to understand humanity by experiment think that by abstracting out everything, all the context, they're going to get at the truth. But by doing that, they will destroy it. They will destroy the truth, because the truth is the context. The truth is all that stuff that makes up the situation. That is what it is to be a human, to know, to understand in the situation. Going back to like Clifford Geertz and the famous winking and all this stuff. Like, what is a wink? A wink is only understood in the context in which it happens. Is it like a sly wink? Is it a sexual wink? Is it a a made up wink on top of winks. None of this makes any sense if you abstract it from the context. The context is the thing that gives the meaning. But this is what we try to do in so many of our sciences and our policy and so on. We think if we could just get rid of all the context, get rid of all the life, all the messiness, then we will finally find the truth. We'll find it in the brain. We'll find it in biology. We'll find it in the genes. And by doing that, you kill it. You kill truth. You kill life. And you can see when people try to intervene in families, try to create the family as this place where you can just, turn it into, as I always say, key performance indicators. Oh, if we could just streamline this and make it something that, you're teaching core curriculum, then we would be able to get at the truth or a better kind of human. But then you destroy it. You destroy that thing because now you've taken all the life out of the family, because now it is an awful drudgery, just like a job where you go in and you're subject to the boss and the man, and you're not, you don't feel any joy in your connection to creativity. Now you don't feel any joy in connection to your offspring. It's like, oh my God, I'm going to screw them up if I don't do all this stuff. So this is our necrophilus orientation that tries to abstract and take all the life out and thinks that it gets closer to the truth, but actually it destroys it.
So another thing that I think is relevant here is the fact that, there are so many kind of bizarre contradictions in Epstein discourse, but we just published something by Julie Bindel recently about this woman who became famous for this memoir slash kind of self-promotional book called which I believe was called The Happy Hooker.
Yeah.
And anyway, the basic, so people can read that. I believe it's just called The Unhappy Hooker, the Bindel piece. But Bindel is obviously known as a critic of sort of the pro sex work feminism argument, which has become pretty prevalent on the left. And I mean, this is something else that's kind of fascinating about, and I'll connect this back to your points you were just making. But something else that's kind of fascinating about the Epstein hysteria is, a lot of what we're actually talking about here were cases of him hiring prostitutes. And, in general, this is something that, if you've been around sort of left spaces or followed them for the past couple decades, sex work, the trendy view is that sex work is great and empowering. And of course, there isn't quite as much enthusiasm for or kind of open advocacy for like lowering the age of consent as there maybe was in the 70s. But there are all kinds of very fashionable arguments, particularly around abolishing the family, that at least point in that direction. Because if you're abolishing the family, part of what you're abolishing is the structure in which children up to the age of majority are sort of contained within this protective structure that kind of mediates their relations to society more broadly. If you're abolishing the family, well, part of what you're doing is enabling children to kind of relate as market actors directly to the rest of society. Obviously, you can sort of see where that's likely to lead in the age of OnlyFans. So I suppose, something else that's kind of interesting here is, there's sort of the scientific technological project of kind of trying to, evacuate the life of humans in order to make them more, comprehensible, manipulable, subject to engineering and so on. And then there's also kind of the conception of humans as market actors, and the way that intersects with sex, because there is sort of an idea that market relations are a safer mode, and again, this is kind of what's fascinating about Epstein in relation to the sort of broader Me Too phenomenon, because part of what the Me Too arguments objected to was that there were all of these kind of not explicitly articulated transaction that they're sort of transactions, but they weren't articulated in the terms of the market, and therefore that's part of why they were unsafe. Sex work could be celebrated, but sort of sleeping with a film producer who kind of pressured you into it because it would probably help your career, wink wink, like that's much more uncomfortable because it doesn't have the kind of purity of a market transaction. And so there's a kind of safety and predictability in market relations that can be used to kind of contain the excess and discomfort of human sexuality. And so, part of what's weird about Epstein is that a lot of what he was engaged in, unlike many of the sort of Me Too, the figures accused in Me Too, was, essentially, trafficking in the sort of, I think the term trafficking is overused here, but he was engaged in a set of market transactions around sex, which in other contexts are sort of being celebrated as empowering, by people who would also, otherwise be very be very likely to treat Epstein as some sort of demonic figure. So there's some kind of odd contradiction in that whole aspect of things as well.
Yeah, I mean that's the tricky thing is that the only space where people can be imagined to have agency is in the market, ironically, and anything that's outside of that, it's like, oh, you're just like this withering kind of flower. But if there's a market, then it makes sense. On the other hand, I mean Epstein supposedly paid, so I retrospectively people are, I mean that's not sex work. It's I don't know why. I suppose because it wasn't like a straight up transaction. It was also with the promise of furthering careers and this sort of thing. And this is where this is where things went wrong.
Right. I mean, yeah, I don't know the exact details of all of his interactions, but clearly, some of it was premised on those kind of promises, and then some of it was just straight up kind of paid sex work. And so again, I think there's a lot of difficulty with that I'd say particularly on the progressive end of things, there's a comfort in, again, the kind of certainty and predictability of market relations as a way of mediating sexuality. And this is why you had so much celebration of, like, I remember going to this kind of very left-wing coded sort of tech and culture conference a couple of times. And I mean, these people who were participating in this conference, they could not get enough of like celebrating this is like 10 years ago or so, but the sort of figure of the cam girl as like the ultimate hero of sort of internet feminism. I mean, it was striking, like just how central that was to what a lot of people in that world were thinking about. And so, I think there is some kind of way the market can function as this reassuring container for what would otherwise be the kind of uncomfortable excesses of sexuality. And so it seems like on one hand, Epstein, I mean, part of what it shows is the way that even when there are these kind of market relations embedded, he's paying these girls for these massages and stuff. Like there's still a lot of a lot of uncomfortable excess within that. So it kind of allows us to notice the ways that that those market transactions don't fully work as a way of sort of evacuating all of the discomfort and excess from the sexual relation. But at the same time, it's interesting that he becomes a place where you can kind of reflect on this relation as exploitative, even when in other contexts, often by the same people, it would sort of be depicted as empowering.
Well, I think probably because if it's functioning as a market, you can regulate a market, right? So you're gonna, if it's above board, that's what people want. They, make everything into a market, then we can subject it to regulation. And that's what the left has become, right? Like, we gave up on moving beyond capitalism, so we just want to regulate. So everybody's always they don't talk about capitalism, they talk about unfettered capitalism. So, like, really, it would be fine if we just could fetter it. If we could have the correct regulation. So part of the issue is that this all happened in clandestine ways. So who knows what went on? How old were these girls? We don't know. So if it had been regulated, it would have been fine. Then we could have been sure. We could have been sure that they were exercising their agency. And it's a similar thing with the family. It's like this desire to regulate, right? If we can, when we subject it to performance indicators, when we subject it to the logic of the market, we like that because now it's out in the open. Now it can be regulated because who knows what the hell goes on behind closed doors. We distrust that. And part of the reason why this creeps across the political spectrum and finds a home on the left is because the left has been emptied of humanism. There isn't any human, there's no faith in the human. And you have this with libertarianism as well. None of this stuff makes sense if there's no human behind it. So if you don't believe, there's no Marxism if you don't believe in the human subject capable of self-determination, autonomy. I mean, to a certain extent, like, obviously bureaucracy and regulation, that is the human subject controlling itself also. But it is born of a deep distrust of anything that happens that isn't strictly regulated, because they don't really believe in, they don't really have a vision of the human subject that is positive. It's a very negative kind of vision. So it's about containing the damage. And it's a similar thing with libertarianism. That's why I think a lot of things go off the rails, because you don't have a humanist ethics anymore. So then what are you even doing this for? To free a market, to regulate, for safety, harm reduction, all of this stuff. And it doesn't make any sense because there's nobody, as I keep saying, there's nobody in the city. There's nobody there. There's nobody at the end. There's no goal at the end point that is fundamentally human. It's just like, it's like damage control or overcoming this sad little human that unfortunately we've been stuck with for too long.
With that, I think we can bring this conversation to a close, but I imagine we will be continuing to touch on these themes. So thanks, as always, Ashley.
Thank you.
And people should read Ashley's Jeffrey Epstein's Necrophilia and Ours at Compact. And if you like what you're hearing, please rate and review us and subscribe on whatever your preferred podcast app is. So that is all for now, and stay tuned for our next episode in the coming weeks. Thanks again.